This episode of the EdTech Startup Show is brought to you by EduHustles. That's www.eduhustles.com. EduHustles is a place where teachers can go to find out about part-time education-related side hustles that they can do using their existing skills and experience. And over my about 10 years of teaching, I've done every education-related side hustle, from running a club to tutoring to working for an online teaching company to doing consulting, blogging, freelancing. And I realized that lots of other teachers were looking for these same kinds of opportunities and also looking to learn about how to get started with this stuff. So if you are an educator, an administrator even, or just curious to see what it's all about, go to www.eduhustles.com, drop your email in there, and introduce yourself when you get the message from me. Also, if you're an education company and you want to talk to me about hiring teachers for education-related part-time jobs, you can reach out to me at gerard@gerarddawson.com. Today's episode is also brought to you by the 5-Day Copy Fix. I've been a teacher for about 10 years, as I've mentioned, and I've helped, fortunately, some of the bigger K-12 edtech companies in America fix their website, emails, content, case studies, etc. by doing one thing, and that's improving the copy. After thinking about what I've learned, mistakes I've made, different techniques and tactics and strategies I've tried, I put it all together for you. And for you, I'm talking about folks working in marketing or founders of education companies or edtech startups, or even a solo education consultant. And I put it together for you in a short 5-day free email course, which, like I mentioned, is called the 5-Day Copy Fix. Now, it's not a magic bullet. It's not going to magically transform your business. However, if you read the 5 lessons, think carefully about how they apply to your specific business situation, and most importantly, apply the ideas, I think you'll see some surprising improvements. So if you're curious to see what it's all about, go to gerarddawson.com, and right on the front page there, you'll see a form to drop in your email and get lesson 1. So put in your email, hit the big button, and once you get that first lesson, please hit reply, introduce yourself, and let me know what you think. You're listening to the EdTech Startup Show, and I'm your host, Gerard Dawson. Tonight, I'm happy to be on the line with Lauren Dachille, the founder and CEO of Nimble. Lauren, thanks for coming on the show.
Sure, I'm happy to be here.
So, Lauren, I'm going to let you explain a little bit more, but Nimble is a company that provides schools and districts with modern tools for K-12 hiring. So I'm curious to talk about, especially right now in this kind of unique time in education, what schools are doing in terms of hiring, and then also just dive into everything you've learned from helping schools and districts, hire teachers and staff. So just to start us off, can you tell me a little bit about what your company does and what your role is?
Yeah, absolutely. So you already gave me a little bit of a head start. So like you said, I'm Lauren. I'm the founder and CEO of Nimble, and we build data-driven hiring software for schools. So at its core, our product is an applicant tracking system, and it's centered around K-12 hiring. So the thing that's special about what we do is that we use predictive analytics to help make recommendations to school principals about which teacher applicants are actually best fit for their classrooms. So ultimately, our goal is to improve teacher performance and retention, and therefore student outcomes by promoting smart hiring decisions.
Yeah. So, right. So it kind of starts with where, in the earliest part of the process, it's getting the right applicants, which, as anybody who's worked in a school knows, teacher turnover, or teachers who are not the best fit for a role, that does, as you're kind of explaining, does have a big impact on student learning. And I always like, there's a few different types of CEOs and founders, or EdTech professionals that come on the show. Sometimes people have like a tech background and they make their way into education technology. Sometimes people have like an MBA in business background, like consulting, and they decide to solve the problem in education. But it's always cool to talk to somebody like you who has experience working in schools. And from what I know, you worked in schools in Washington, D.C., which seems like a particular, probably an interesting situation. So I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about your experience in D.C. schools and how that leads you to the work you're doing today.
Yeah, absolutely. So at DCPS, I was part of the human capital team, and there I focused primarily on teacher recruitment and selection. So in that experience, one of the things that I learned was that even though we had a team of really smart and hardworking people, we were limited by antiquated and outdated tools. And pretty much anyone who's listening to this, if there is anyone who's listening to this that has worked in a district before, especially with HR and finance tools, you probably know that those can be very, very outdated, like decades outdated. And the reason why that matters is because when it comes to hiring teachers, part of the process is always going to be selling them on your district and on your school, which can be really difficult to do when they're applying through outdated software and then they experience a really slow process and there's a lack of communication in the screening process, et cetera. So the need for something to streamline and modernize hiring really struck me when I was at DCPS. So that was one factor that kind of played into my, I guess you could say, founding story of Nimble. But the biggest inspiration for founding Nimble was actually around the idea of predictive analytics. So DCPS has been working for probably just about a decade now on this question of whether it's possible to predict teacher performance during the application process. And there was some really interesting research on that, particularly on the work at DCPS that was published back in 2016. And that work was ultimately what inspired me to start Nimble, because I thought, if it's possible for DCPS as a district to systematically predict which applicants will be great teachers, then that is technology that should be scalable and that we should be putting at every district's fingertips. And that's really what we're trying to do with Nimble.
Yeah. So it's always fascinating to me when somebody, at least to an extent, kind of starts by solving a problem that for instance, you've experienced firsthand. So just out of curiosity, because it does seem like lots of people, start something or start working on something while they have a current role. Like for me, I'm a teacher. I do the podcast on the side. What was it like for you? Did you really have this idea while you were still working in the schools, or did you kind of have a clean cut and then leave and go do it? What was that like for you?
Yeah, well, so I didn't go straight from DCPS to Nimble. I worked in DC for a while, and then I actually moved into the policy world. I thought, maybe there's a way to have impact outside of a specific district, but more at the systemic level. So I worked for a nonprofit that was doing policy and advocacy work around teacher quality and school choice policies in a bunch of states around the country. And I got really familiar with the policy landscape around education. And we could have a whole podcast talking about the policy and the politics of education. I think what I learned from that experience was really that there are a lot of politics around the world of education. They're very complicated to influence. And, there's a lot of really entrenched parties that are pushing forward policies that may or may not always be best for kids. And so I ultimately decided that I wanted to make an impact in a way that was outside of the policy lens. And so I decided to create a tool that could help enable and empower districts to make smarter human capital decisions regardless of the policy landscape that they're in. And so one of the things about hiring that's interesting And that sort of contrasts it with, performance evaluation or tenure, for example, is that it's sort of outside of the typical policy and political process, right? This is not totally true across the board, but most of the decisions that districts make around hiring are pretty squarely within their control rather than being dictated by the state level policy landscape.
Yeah, that's a good point. And excuse me, that's a good point. I hadn't really considered that. It's kind of like once the teacher is in the classroom, then politics and decisions from governments play a role. But that is something that does seem very much within the district's control. That's cool.
Yeah.
How you kind of added that extra layer of experience by learning about the policy, but then still realizing that hiring was a kind of an access point for you to give districts this kind of leverage. So, the podcast I always say it's business, education, and technology. Often because of what companies are doing, they're doing really cool things, but it's not always necessarily, the tech is not always necessarily one of the main focuses. However, I was really curious to ask you about this phrase predictive technology, because it's something I hear often now, and I feel like it's something that people might have a general understanding of, but maybe don't always know what it would mean in practice. So can you, let's say I was totally kind of new to this idea. How is Nimble using this thing, predictive technology, to actually kind of help districts?
Sure. So essentially what we're doing is trying to help districts with pattern recognition over time. So if in the past certain elements of an application have been indicative of high performance or long-term retention, we're going to try to flag applicants who are similar to help districts more quickly identify the folks who have the highest potential. So to get a little more in the weeds, I think our approach is fairly straightforward. What we do is we look at the application data points. So some of your listeners may not be familiar with the applicant tracking system itself, but this is basically the tool that districts use to post their jobs and that teachers use to apply for those jobs. So we're organically collecting all of this information in the application process, things like work history data, reference checks, educational history, et cetera. And then over time, we match those data points with classroom performance outcomes to see if there's a predictive relationship. And then, we use that relationship to make predictions and recommendations going forward. So in terms of getting a little more specific about the actual things that we're optimizing for, we have two outcomes that we look for. One would be classroom performance or classroom effectiveness, and the other one would be teacher retention. And so when it comes to classroom performance, to dig a little deeper there, we're looking at student growth. So we're not looking at the raw proficiency of a teacher's classroom. We're looking at something called a value-added measure, which is basically, it's what most researchers use to quantify teacher performance. And it controls for certain variables that are outside of the teacher's control and tries to isolate that individual teacher's impact on student learning over the course of an academic year. So to kind of take a step back and sum it up, we're looking at patterns and application data that predict someone's ability to produce strong student growth in the classroom and their likelihood of being retained in that district over time. And this is actually a topic, I don't know if I'm getting too into the weeds, but this is a topic that there's been a lot of research into over the last several years. There's been a good bit of published work, and we're constantly trying to incorporate all of these new methods into the Nimble model in real time. So just to give you a quick example, there's a group of researchers at the University of Minnesota that recently found important predictive patterns in work history data, as well as reasons for leaving prior jobs. And they also found that by using a machine learning approach to quantify those work experiences, they could help reduce bias in the hiring process and make it more equitable, which, as you probably know, is pretty important right now because we have such a lack of diversity in the teacher workforce. So that's a big area of focus for a lot of districts. So those researchers are currently advising Nimble on how we can incorporate this approach into our predictive model. And overall, our goal is to keep ensuring that the model is research-based and that we're constantly improving it over time.
Got it. So a few interesting things in there I'd like to
Yeah.
ask about. So re I could imagine there could be some kind of funny or maybe just interesting insights, like you mentioned, for example, reason for leaving past jobs. So I could see, you know, obviously, like, be interesting to figure out what people are actually willing to share in terms of the reasons they leave the jobs, and then which ones might be predictive of either positive or not so positive outcomes. So overall, I'm just kind of, my brain is, kind of buzzing with ideas about the insights that you might have been able to help districts uncover. Or I'm also curious about, maybe on a anonymized level, if you kind of have a higher level of insights from data, like about districts as a whole. What are some cool things that Nimble's been able to uncover about those trends that maybe align with research?
Yeah, you might imagine that I get asked this question fairly often.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think before I go into some fun details, I should say that I think that question kind of sheds light on what I think is an important nuance of what we do. So the reality is that there's really not, and there probably never will be, one indicator or a couple of indicators that predict teacher performance so strongly that they can be used in isolation. So there's lots of consulting work that gets done with districts where, the consultant will tell districts, here, look for these 5 things, GPA, practice scores. On the average, these things tend to be correlated with high, strong teacher performance. And I think that is almost always a fool's errand, because the correlation coefficient for each of those individual predictors is never going to be high enough that you can use it to make an informed decision. So the purpose of building a predictive model directly into the applicant tracking interface is that we get hundreds of data points at once about every single applicant, and we can make a pretty complex calculation of predicted performance and retention in real time based on each of those variables and how they interact with each other. So I'm going to preface my actual answer to your question by just saying it's very difficult to straightforwardly say, here's one of the things that predicts teacher quality, because if the answer were that simple, I could have just written a blog post instead of starting a company. So,
Good point.
so I'll start with that, but I can also give you a more satisfying answer. So one of the kind of interesting and mostly untapped areas of predictive power is applicant metadata. So looking not only at the content of someone's application, but also about looking at information about how they behave through the application process. And we've actually found that there are certain pieces of metadata, things like, for example, when in the hiring season a candidate submits their application, or how many different types of jobs do they apply to? Like, do they come to your job board and apply for, 1 or 2 specific roles, or do they apply to everything from school principal to school custodian? Questions like that can actually be very strong predictors of performance and retention. And this is, funny enough, it's something that many recruiters know intuitively and kind of talk about, but there hasn't really been a clear way of quantifying that before and using it systematically. So I think that the behavioral data, the metadata, is something that's really interesting and has a lot of potential.
Got it. Interesting. So for the applicants out there, you have to choose school custodian or school principal. Do not apply to
Not
both.
both.
Interesting. Cool. That makes sense though, right? The time of year, the frequency of applications, right? Those behaviors that kind of show intent, and maybe some other intangible things that are hard to get from, for example, a resume, I guess. So, right now we're speaking in early May 2020. Something like, last I checked, well over 30 schools are closed for the rest of the year. My school in New Jersey, and all schools in my state are closed, but schools and districts still need to make plans for the future, right? So a service like what your company is providing is still relevant. So as I was preparing to talk to you, I was reading one of the articles on your website. It was called "Demo Lessons at Scale in a Virtual Environment," and it was cool because it got me thinking back to doing a demo lesson, which is a pretty anxiety-inducing experience.
Yeah.
I actually strangely always liked it. Felt like I was in like a sports situation, like because all these people watching and high stakes, but it's probably just a weird uh, nuance of myself.
Well, yeah, maybe you were, maybe, you were a teacher, maybe you're extroverted that way.
Right, right. But there is, there's a lot of it's an interesting experience, and even for administrators, right? They have this somewhat high stakes decision to make, and they want to make the most of this opportunity as well. So, a long-winded introduction to ask, what are you noticing, and what kind of like questions or conversations are you having about how schools are handling the hiring process right now?
Yeah, that's definitely a hot topic at the moment. So first off, I've been really impressed with how quickly a lot of the talent and HR leaders are making these adjustments in real time. They all recognize that it's the height of the hiring season and hiring has to continue. So they're really working on figuring out how they can adapt their processes. I would say one of the biggest challenges as far as hiring goes is the piece of the process that usually happens, not surprisingly, the piece of the process that happens on site in the school, that's kind of the roadblock for a lot of folks. So usually, and you probably know this from your experience, before giving you a job, the principal is going to bring you into the school. If possible, you get to meet that person face to face. Sometimes if it's during the school year, you get to kind of do a demo lesson in a classroom. And that piece of the process where principals are really used to being able to get FaceTime with a candidate, I think is something that's challenging, especially in a field that's very people driven. So a lot of the districts are working right now on facilitating virtual demo lessons. So are they collecting pre-recorded demo lessons? Are they providing a framework for principals to facilitate demo lessons on Zoom? Those are some of the questions that we were trying to help them answer in the blog post. And so that's kind of why we focus on that topic. But of course, there's also lots of other questions and conversations that are happening across talent teams currently. In general, I would say Nimble's technology makes a lot of space for our existing district customers to already have brought any paper processes online and kind of automated a lot of the hiring process. So most of them are in a pretty good position to do this hiring virtually. So where we're kind of focusing our additional support is around supplementary materials. So content on best practices, how can we bring districts together to share what they're doing and share their biggest questions. So there's a lot of questions about how to adjust their staffing projections for this year because resignations are generally declining. We're not totally sure what's going to happen with retirements, budgets are getting cut, et cetera. How to grapple with those budget changes, what does successful virtual recruitment look like, things like that. So for those types of questions, we actually have a repository of free resources online, and that's available to Nimble customers and other districts. So anyone can go to our website and check those out. But they're targeted at HR and talent teams. Folks can also go there and request access to some of the recordings of our live events and webinars where districts have shared best practices. So if there are any K-12 HR folks listening to your podcast, which, it could be a stretch, but you never know.
I'd like to think so.
they can come to our website and check out some free resources and kind of tips and webinars to help them navigate some of the challenges that we're seeing.
Cool. Yeah. So that makes sense. You feel like you're already what you're already doing is helps districts to make the best of the situation. So you're giving additional helpful information and trying to just be a good resource for them.
Yeah.
in other districts.
Yeah, I think tech is sort of one piece of the puzzle, and you can't have tech without best practices, and you can't have best practices without strong tech. So Nimble typically provides the strong technology, and now that we're in this challenging time, we're sort of trying to fill in even more of the best practices piece to make sure that districts have the resources they need.
Yeah. So switching gears a little bit, and we were kind of joking around about this question before, but let's say I'm on the other end. Let's say you're talking to somebody who's, either switching careers or just out of college, or maybe they need to find a new job because unfortunately they lost theirs. Whatever you feel like would be I guess, the persona you want to kind of pick. But from what you've seen, all these conversations with HR people at districts, to an extent, if we look at the other side of the process, you have to be knowledgeable about, what candidates maybe could do or should do. So if you were going to give me like a couple of pointers to get hired, what might those be?
Sure. Well, one, I would say definitely apply early. Typically, there's a huge wave of hiring that happens in the summer, and you can set yourself apart by making sure you get your application in early spring, and then you have plenty of time to sort of build that relationship at the district level. And once you've gone through the district level screening, you have more time to understand which schools could be a good fit for you and to engage with principals. So that's one piece. I think pertinent to virtual hiring for things like Zoom interviews, dress the same way that you would for a regular in-person interview. It's going to make a positive impression. It's going to make you feel better and more professional. Make sure you're finding a quiet space and testing your tech beforehand, because as I'm sure you've experienced with recording this podcast, the tech issues that you can run into on Zoom are many. So make sure that you've fully tested that stuff. And whenever you apply for a district role, I would say it's always important as well to reach out to the principal if there's a particular school or set of schools that you're interested in, because that just puts sort of a personal touch to your name, and principals might be looking at a pretty broad pool of applicants. And so it's nice to be able to set yourself apart with that direct contact. And then I guess the last thing I can say is, if you don't already, it's really great practice to have a demo lesson on hand. So if you have recordings of yourself in a classroom, or if you're a new teacher and you have videos from your student teaching experience, I think those can all be really helpful, especially now in the context of virtual hiring. But in general, it's great to have those things on hand so that you're prepared if that is part of a district screening process.
Yeah, that, just to kind of underline that last point, I think that's a great suggestion. So either have just maybe something written for a starting point, but then ideally basically a recording or audio or video of yourself actually in front of the classroom. That's what you're suggesting?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And for teachers who are curious about that, I mean, that's never really been easier to do than than now. Easy, well, maybe not right now, but generally with smartphone or different tools like Swivel and things like that. So yeah, that's definitely a good tip. So moving for, we talked a little bit about your Nimble's role kind of in the education ecosystem, and then a little bit about the technology used to do what Nimble does. From the business side of things, before you were referring to basically some of the content, which is at least related to the support and marketing that Nimble does for either existing partners, customers, or just general audience. I'm curious, just in general though, about maybe what's unique about Nimble as a business. And I ask that because just from my background as a teacher, I've spoken to a lot of companies who use sort of a grassroots or bottom up approach of getting accounts with schools and districts, where they have maybe a free version for teachers, or they have they try to get a groundswell of teachers at their school, and then turn that into a school license, and then maybe eventually into a district license. And that works really well for those companies. But kind of by necessity, your Nimble is a school or district level product. So I'm curious just about what's what you've learned from once you began Nimble and started having to sell to schools and districts, and maybe what advice you might give to somebody who's also building a tool that's for kind of administrative offices at a school.
Yeah, you're totally right. Those two things are very different. I would even say within the universe of district level sales, there's a lot of points of differentiation. Just as one example, with applicant tracking, there are a couple of pretty big conglomerate companies who cornered this market with software that's a couple decades old now. So we have incumbents who we're trying to unseat. So for us, the concern is less about finding budget, which is a concern for a lot of ed tech companies. But for us, the budget is already there. It's actually much more about educating our decision makers on why getting a better applicant tracking system should matter to them. Because in their case, when you've been ping-ponging back and forth between roughly comparable systems for a couple of decades and changing system has never really given you very much benefit, you're probably not going to be particularly optimistic that changing systems matters or is going to be helpful to you. So what we have been trying to do is really just trying to quantify the pain point for those decision makers. So just as an example, one of the ways that we've done this is through a hiring study that we just finished. So we worked with 4 large districts. On average, they were about 50,000 students each. And one of the analyses that we did was a time allocation analysis for the HR team. So we did structured interviews to kind of dig into across the entire org chart of HR, exactly how are they allocating their manpower and woman power. What we found was that the average HR team spends around 40 to 50% of their time on manual work. So things like data entry, creating their own reports, plugging information into Google spreadsheets, and the list goes on, but they have some very crazy workarounds and they sink a ton of time into it. So Nimble actually automates a lot of this work and frees up their time for more strategic work. So our approach is really focused again on helping them think differently about what a strategic approach to talent could look like with stronger systems in place. So again, we're just trying to quantify that problem for them and make them really understand and feel the magnitude of it. So that's our general approach. I would say as far as advice goes, one book that I really enjoyed on this topic was called Play Bigger. And it talks about the concept of shaping your category and influencing the customer's perception of the problem that they need to solve. And then the other thing I would say is that this is not a sales tactic per se, but I think it's really important for founders to make sure that their financing model matches the growth trajectory of their company. So as an example, not to pick on venture capital, but I don't think that venture capital is necessarily the right fit for the growth rate of every ed tech company and every business model. So early stage founders have to consider their alternatives to venture capital if that's what their business model requires. And so when you're thinking about your approach to sales and you're thinking about realistic projected growth, you also have to think about how am I going to get this off the ground and what are the financing models, if needed, that are going to support that.
Right. Yeah. Instead of just kind of taking it as the given path, like
exactly. Yeah, because it's a very small proportion of companies that's going to end up being successful taking that path, and for good reason, because venture capital investors have their own economics that they have to worry about, and there's only certain companies that are going to be a fit for that.
Yeah, right. Especially with public education in particular being a very unique market with the sales cycle and the length of it and a bunch of other factors. Going back a little bit, I really like this kind of piqued my interest when you were talking about doing the study with the large districts and noticing all of the workarounds that folks in the HR offices had. Just anyone who's worked in an office or really any job knows sometimes you have that, like, okay, we do this by just putting all this stuff in this document, and then that person copies it down and does it on a spreadsheet. I've actually noticed that's actually a great sign that a new tool needs to be built. I've heard, I forget who it was, somebody said like one of the best signs that there's an area ripe for innovation is people trying to kind of hack together the tools that they don't have. So that's really cool to hear. Also just from me my perspective as a writer, it seemed like an awesome project getting to gather together all that insight from those large districts.
Yeah.
Is that something
it was incredibly interesting. Yeah. It was time consuming, but it was a very interesting project. And there were a lot of things that I felt instinctively to be true based off of my experience at DCPS that we got some really, really tangible confirmation of throughout this process. And so in some moments, it was just mind-blowing because you hear the workarounds that people are doing and all of the sort of red tape that they face in their day-to-day. And you just wish that you could solve all of those problems at once for them. But so there was some frustration, but at the same time, it did shed a lot of light and confirmed some of what we're working on, which is satisfying in a sense as well.
Yeah, yeah. So I know from your background between working in DC public schools and then also your policy background, you came into running Nimble with obviously a set of assumptions and also a really large knowledge and experience base about this problem that you're solving. But it's actually making me think, on the other hand, if there's anything where you've been really surprised about what you've learned from just your work running the company or solving this problem so far.
Where to begin? I would say that, well, we're in a space that is where there are big incumbents, like I mentioned. And at the beginning of the journey, I think that felt very much, that our size felt very much like a disadvantage to me. So, I would sort of try to downplay the degree to which we were a small business or a startup in conversations with districts. But I actually think that one of the biggest surprises and one of my biggest learnings has been the degree to which that can actually be an advantage in this space. There are so many districts that are just sort of fed up with the constant stream of acquisitions, the cuts that a lot of the larger companies, which are usually private equity backed, have had to make over the years. And I think districts are also starting to get a little bit more savvy about false promises. So especially around interoperability, typically when a company has acquired a whole bunch of products under their umbrella, but they weren't built together, they're not really going to speak to each other as promised, right? And that is, interoperability is a big theme with districts, and it's something that those big conglomerates have tried to push. But over the years, districts have become a little bit disenchanted with that. And I think they're ready for something a little different and more relationship-driven vendors. So with Nimble, one of my big learnings over the years has just been that customers so appreciate how hands-on and responsive we're able to be as a small business, because not everything that we have to do has to be totally scalable at this stage, right? We can really bend over backwards to make sure that each of our customers is satisfied. And we also happen to be a public benefit corporation, so we're very mission driven and pretty aligned with our districts in that way. So being a small company that's really hands-on, where a district can feel like a big fish in a small pond, is something that I think is increasingly appealing to district leaders. And I think I've learned that it can be really wise as a founder to lean into that as a selling point rather than shying away from it.
Right. So districts know, and really any technology user, I feel like at this point knows, there's even the phrase kind of like, it's not too much used in education, but big tech, right? So we're kind of, the personalization goes from being a good thing to something nefarious. But yeah, I feel like you even have it built into your company with the name, right? You're Nimble, which is kind of what districts would need, where you can give them more personalized support. That's cool, right? Because I can see how the initial reaction would be, totally understandably, we need to present an air of size or experience, but it's interesting that you've noticed that that's been an advantage. So actually, this one thing, another thing I read, a past interview you did with the website Education Next. I had a little quote that I wanted to read for a second, which relates pretty closely to what we're talking about. Hopefully it won't be repetitive, but you said, one of the reasons districts aren't sold yet on the benefits of novel approaches and user-friendly tools is because there are too few companies and founders willing to inject a bit of healthy competition into this space. I thought that was a really cool point. Products should have to be outstanding to get districts to use them, but unfortunately, there are too many complacent incumbent companies and products out there today. So this is kind of underlining the point that you were just making. And it's also interesting because I guess some people think like there's too many startup. So there's so many EdTech startups. So why do you say actually almost the opposite? There's too few.
Yeah. Well, this is probably all relative to the space that I happen to be in. I mean, I know that there are plenty of companies that are building solutions out for the classroom, and I'm sure that most of those are very much needed. But maybe some folks who think there are a lot of ed tech companies are focused on the classroom space. I think for me, I kind of lived in that HR kind of back office finance world, and most of the technology in that world is incredibly outdated, and there are not a ton of startups who are really playing in that space. And it's a tough space to get into. I mean, it's tough to get the financing. It's tough to get districts to make a change when there's not kind of a burning impetus for them to do it now. So I certainly understand the challenges, and those all resonate with me. But I think that it's really important for startups to pursue that. And if we want to have an education industry that is innovative and where the stakeholders are served with high quality technology, because the lack of innovation, at least in my space, which is K-12 HR, has led to just these really kind of outdated and antiquated tools. So yeah, I mean, I would say in general, I hope that all startup founders who are looking at this space will pursue it and will try to find sort of a unique and authentic problem in that area. And it's certainly tough competition, and it can be challenging, but I encourage you, like I said before, to sort of lean into your differentiators as a small and nimble business. I'll of course never get tired of using that pun, but and that can be something that helps you to kind of bring on new clients and differentiates you from the competition that's out there.
Yeah. That's cool. You're mentioning it can be hard to get a large district, for example, to come on, but even that has to have, benefits too. There's larger contracts, obviously, and then also even just from a emotional standpoint, it has to be exciting when, of course, for somebody who works with teachers and they get one new teacher user, that's, everybody matters, but it has to be exciting and kind of, maybe again, just my own personality, exhilarating to get to kind of know you're impacting, a district with hundreds or thousands of students impacted.
Yeah, it completely is. The RFP process is, slightly less exhilarating, but but the ultimate outcome is really exciting. And yeah, it feels good to serve large districts and to feel that you're really making an impact and helping them move what is the most important lever that they have, which is teacher quality.
Okay. So it seems like there's lots of cool things that, that Nimble has the opportunity to do as you help districts learn more about their hiring process and learn more about what might lead to teacher success and then ultimately student learning. So I'm always fascinated by the forward-looking plans that founders have, especially when they can kind of build on what they're currently doing or even just expand more of the same. So for you, what are you looking forward to with your work with Nimble?
Sure. Yeah. When I started Nimble, we were making a lot of pitch decks, and you kind of have to have sort of a concise, like, here's the 7-year plan. This is where we're headed. And, in a lot of those presentations, we would talk about sort of growing and expanding to serve the teacher facing side of the market. So in a way, helping teachers to, given their skills and background, helping them to identify the opportunities that might be a good fit for them. But over time, what I've learned about our business is that there are so many paths that are open to us when it comes to improving the lives of folks who are working in school districts every day and improving their efficiency and productivity, which, the end game is student outcomes. And so, to be totally honest, I think there's more to be done in back office HR. I mean, that sounds incredibly unsexy, but but there are so many tools that are lacking in the world of an HR team and a talent team. So, just as one small example, helping them to verify teacher credentials and map a path for their teachers who aren't fully credentialed or who have only a preliminary credential, map that path for them to become fully credentialed. Like that in itself could be a product. It's something that serves our existing customer, that makes them more efficient and effective, and ultimately helps boost teacher quality. So I think that there's tons of opportunity for us to build out tools that serve the same customer and that ultimately have an impact on efficiency within districts. So I guess all that is to say that the path is not yet decided. Right now, we're focused on growing applicant tracking and some of our ancillary modules around recruitment and onboarding, and making as much impact as possible in the market using those tools. And then I think over time, we'll start to uncover more about which strategic path makes the most sense.
Yeah, I would have loved a simpler way to figure out if I had actually done what I needed to do to be a full-fledged teacher, from the various levels of certification. So,
yeah,
amongst like you said, there's lots of problems to solve. But yeah,
too many.
The paperwork in regards to becoming a teacher or applying, it's certainly a great place to work on improving. So, Lauren, it's been really cool to talk to you about your experience and your company and what you've learned. So for folks who want to learn more, maybe about Nimble or to connect with you, where would you like to suggest that they go or do?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for giving the shameless plug opportunity. So if anyone's interested in learning more about our work, or if any folks want to tap into the free virtual hiring resources that we've been compiling, you can check out our website. So it's www.hirenimble.com, and that's HIRE Nimble. And I'm also just happy to make myself available if there are EdTech founders out there who want to talk strategy, or just folks in the education space who are curious about what we do or want to nerd out on human capital policy. I'm here. So my email is lauren@hirenimble.com, and anyone who's listening can feel free to reach out as well.
Great. And yeah, if you are a listener who is in the K-12 HR space or the HR tech space, please make sure, we need to know you're here. Reach out to Lauren, let us know you're listening. But until next time, everybody, my name is Gerard Dawson, and thank you for listening to the EdTech Startup Show. Lauren, thanks again for coming on.
Thank you.